Thanks, Dashun. So thanks, everybody, and of course, mostly the organizers here for bringing me to Boston. It's my first time here. It's amazing, right? I had to wait so long to get here. I'm not lazy. I travel a lot, but for some reasons, it never happened before. One more reason to thank you guys. So yes, Dashun mentioned it already. I'm kind of a cluster finder, and I want to keep searching for cluster until I finally find one. But another part of my activity starting a few years ago, and continuing now, that we have also this big data set of ISI Web of Science that Brian and many other people here are so familiar with, is studying citation analysis and, of course, also the interaction patterns between scientists. How we give credit to each other, we collaborate with each other, we produce value. And this is basically what I would like to talk here. So the focus is on citation measures as measures of impact. And the talk is divided in two parts, in fact. I will first talk about the issue whether you should, this is kind of well known already, the fact that you shouldn't really take citations, the bare number of citations into consideration because it's strongly field dependent. So it should really go for normalized indicators. If you do it, then you get, something more stable. I claim universal, but somehow it's a good approximation of universality. And then something more recent that we've been doing, also with Alex Peterson here, is about this issue of predictability of measures of success in science, particularly the H index, and I would say in general, cumulative measures of success. So I will go through these things, so normalized indicators, scaling universalities, and then, of course, predictability is the second part of the talk. And I will point out that predicting a cumulative measure is easy. So it's not really prediction in many respects, in contrast to what some people may think. Whereas non-cumulative metrics instead are more meaningful because you don't have a lot of autocorrelations. On the other hand, they don't seem to be so easy to predict, which is good because it means that we have something to do from now on, right? This is kind of day one of this community gathering. And then I will summarize a little bit what we did. So this is a little presentation of schematic basic numbers about some disciplines of ISI Web of Science, which divides science in many disciplines. At that time, there were 172 for science and engineering. So there's no social science in here, from acoustics to zoology. This is the year where papers were published in this discipline, so under this label. Of course, each of these disciplines includes many journals. It's a variable number of journals. There are many in some disciplines, like hematology, and of course, math, microbiology. Maybe a little less in allergy or anesthesiology. So should invest more about this. This is the number of papers, as you can see, published in that year, this reference here that you see on the left, mostly 1999, but we took also other years. This is the average number of citations that these papers had made when we made the study, until when we made the study, 2008, since their publication. So you see this number varies a lot. So it goes from very low numbers, like 5.97 here, to almost 40 or even more. Even if, of course, all these papers had the exact same time to collect citations. So this is kind of well known. If you had to choose blindly, number of citations become really the golden standard. And of course, it's not really the case. We should all do microbiology or hematology and so on. So very few people should be in this room right now, right? So we should be doing something else in different labs and with other people. And this is the maximum number of citations of these papers measured in 2008. Of course, it really depends on when these things were published, but most of these things are 1999, and you can see that there is some heterogeneity. So the maximum number of papers collected by paper, the maximum number of citations collected by paper published in this category in 9 years, because we made a study in 2008, was only 42. However, there is a paper here which says 1,400. So this is actually 1990. Let me see. OK, this is 1,000 citations. So there's a big variability. And this is reflected, of course, in the profile of the distribution. This is just for some fields. This is a C0, so this average number of citations collected since 1999 mostly, but since some reference year that we took mostly 1999 until 2008. So there is a big variability, and of course, this is, seems to be reflected in the profile of the distribution. Some distributions stretch, of course, towards large number of citations because there are some of these big gems with a lot of citations. Some others don't make it, like in this case, engineering, aerospace. So the easiest thing that a physicist, former physicist, theoretical particle physicist, whatever, would think, but also trained in statistical physics, is, does this C0 have anything to do with that? Can it be that if we normalize the number of citations by the average number of citations of all papers in the same discipline in the same time, we get something more stable than that? And of course, the answer is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about these things now. So they took 14 fields, selected more or less randomly at the time. There are more recent investigations which they consider the whole Web of Science. They found a few deviations, but they're usually correlated to low values of seed zeros when, since number of citations cannot be negative, of course, then also the whole profile of distribution can be affected by this if the mean is too close to 0. But we're investigating that too. Anyway, based on the data we had at that time, and of course this thing has been also verified lately, you see that if you really divide, so this CF is C divided by C0, the performance of a paper by the average performance of the papers in the same category in the same year, then you get something more stable. So you can really compare a paper, or the success, if you want, of a paper in different disciplines if you do that. At least it's a much better thing to do than using the bare number of citations. So this is a paper when we did that. Interestingly enough, and that's the reason why I consider different years, at least in the last 20 years, this distribution didn't seem to have changed very much, as you can see here. So of course, the seed zeros, these are now 3 disciplines at 3 different years. The seed zeros change because obviously there is more or less time to collect citations because it's from that moment until 2008 when we made the study. But if you divide by the right seed zero, so the corresponding set of papers, then you get something stable here, which is approximately a log normal. If you want really to fit it all, that's what we try to do mostly, except perhaps this initial part. Although the tail is still compatible, it's not, does not reject the power law hypothesis. But then, of course, you have to go only for the tail. So it's the usual compromise. Shall I have a good fit of everything or a great fit of a part of it? It's the usual problem that we have when you fit something. So I leave this to you. So this was somehow this introductory part of the talk about this, which is somehow kind of old work in a sense. So be careful about normalization. Normalization is very important. It may not be, this one might not be necessarily the best one, but at least if you somehow scale things down by some measure which is representative of the community, you may get something more stable. And it can be used across communities to make comparative evaluations. The other thing is, of course, since science of success, predicting success is not everybody's game, certainly in this room. So whenever you want to make predictions about yourself, of course, you may have high expectations. But reality can be a little different, can be hard sometimes. Although, and I tell you just straight, what's better, a world without relativity or without pizza? So I just leave it to you. Okay? All right. Because I'm Italian, I'm very sensitive to that. So let's not draw conclusions which are a little too hasty. So of course, usually what happens is you're in between. Although I think that if I hadn't switched from particle physics to this stuff, complex business, I would be probably doing this right now. But where you exactly stand is kind of, not really easy to understand, of course. So there's a lot of work to do. And then, of course, what is the measure you try to reproduce? We are vectors. We are characterized by multiple dimensions. But of course, in the last few years, at least since 2005, this dimension has acquired some level of popularity, which was really amazing. This very simple number, the H-index, that I'm sure they are all familiar with. Does anybody not know what the H-index is? Oh, good, that's the right audience then. I thought it was just next door. I had to go talk. It's very easy, If you have H-index of H, it means that you have at least H papers with at least H citation. That's the highest number for which this rule applies. Like in this case, you have this bisection here. You rank your papers from the most cited to the least cited, and then the H-index is the point. So this basically this value here on the H-axis as long as you stay above this diagonal. So, and we talk about this because for some mysterious reasons, this paper published in 2005, this was a survey that I made last week, has collected more than 3,000 citations today. And in a nonlinear way. So it got more citations last year than it got in the previous year and so on. So it's really still growing. And of course, if you know this somehow by definition, since you keep producing papers, this number can only increase with time. So it cannot decrease. So it's a cumulative measure of impact because it takes into account both your productivity and the impact in terms of number of citations of what you do. But it also grows. It cannot go down. So by construction, in a sense. Of course, then you can propose modification. But here we're speaking about the real H-index. If you take somehow the schematic view of the career of a scientist, you have an initial phase, say PhD studies, a few papers, first collaborations, then you start to become more independent. There is a middle age, which is when you start doing these job interviews we've been discussing before. We heard about this. If you're lucky, you move to green. Otherwise, there is still the pizza man waiting for you. And the question is, of course, can I predict what the H index is in a successive stage. For instance, from the PhD level to this middle phase, or from the middle phase to the more established phase in which you are somehow more or less respectable scientist with a tenure position. So this was the question. And to discuss this question, which was not really posed by us, and coming to that in the next slide, we use a number of some data sets that we have and that we created, also with the help of people like Alex or Ryan Penn. I know I will mention them, of course, at the end of this presentation. From physics, people publishing physical review letters, many papers, or also many citations. 200 people from that, prolific authors of Cell, publishing many papers in Cell. We've seen also in the previous talks how influential this journal is, what a high impact factor it has in biology. Prolific mathematicians, people who publish many papers, so that the 50 most productive mathematicians publishing in the Annals of Mathematics, which is where you find things like, for instance, the Fermat-Last theorem demonstration, this kind of nice achievement. Then you have also 100 young assistant professors, 2 from each of top 50 physics and astronomy departments in the US. And then graphene scientists and biologists from ResearchID. ResearchID is this program from Thomson Reuters to give people the possibility of not getting troubles with disambiguation, with issues. Basically, it's you, so you get a label, and then you put your papers there, and then people from the outside can make sure that, if this is you, then, these are just your papers. There is no paper from somebody with the same name working in a different or even the same field attributed to you. So in a sense, because the main problem when you collect data at individual level is disambiguation. If you just pick them from a data set, like these huge data sets, and maybe, of course, many names which are similar or difficult to disambiguate, there may be people like me working in theoretical particle physics until some years ago, and then afterwards on totally different things. If you check the profile, it may look like 2 different guys. In a sense, maybe it's true. And the total is 476 physicists, 236 biologists, and 50 mathematicians. So these are the people for whom you will see the results in the next slide. Our interest in this project was stimulated by a paper published last year in Nature by Acuna et al. From University of Northwestern University of Chicago. So probably, I don't know if Brian knows them because, of course, it's kind of close to you. It's a comment, so it's not really a paper, but it was peer-reviewed. And it's about predicting the future H index. They have a formula, which is a linear regression model with a number of coefficients that you can get. And they're not always the same, but can give you somehow high correlation values between the expectation, so the expected value from the formula and the real value of the H index of the people. They targeted about 3,000 neuroscientists. So it's a entirely different data set. So this is the formula. It's a linear regression formula. You see, this is the H index at time t plus delta t. And this is intercept. This is a dependence on the current H index before you make the prediction. So at time t. This is a square root of the number of, publications, co-authors. Yeah, I wonder if there is a square root of number of citations too. But there are many more. Actually, they consider initially a set of 18 variables, and then they brought it down to 5. They still found high values for this square correlation coefficient R square. This is the career age, how many years since your first publication. This is the number of distinct journals where you published, so to show somehow your variety of interest. You don't always publish in the same journal, especially if you publish, this is a QT, on a high-impact journal. So this is a number which should be important, how many papers you publish in Science, Nature, PNAS, Cell, these kind of things. So what they found, of course, we did the same thing for our data set, so we're not really reproducing their curves on the paper because we're working on a different data set, but it's consistent, would be this curve here showing how the square correlation coefficient changes with the time into the future that you're trying to make the prediction. So of course, the farther you go to the future, the worse the prediction is going to be. There are so many factors playing a role in that. However, the main point is that this number seems to be pretty high. The maximum is 1, and it stays not so far from this value, even many years in the future. So if you do it on our data sets, here for physicists and biologists, you get more or less the same behavior. So the red curve is the one corresponding to all scientists put together in these 2 categories, right? Where all means of all career ages, which is one of the 2 biases I would like to point out here. That predicting what happens to young guys is much more difficult than predicting what happens to established people, especially a measure like this, which can only increase. So the 2 things are tied, and I'm coming to that afterwards. So when you try to disentangle career ages, so put different age cohorts, for instance, people 3 years after their first paper, or 5 years after the first paper, or 7 years, you see that the prediction goes worse. However, the values are still not too bad. If you take even a few years in the future, even 5, some of these values are still fairly high. So you might still conclude that perhaps this is not such a bad way to infer impact or the future age index. However, this is a bias of the specific features of the age index. The age index is a cumulative measure. Like I said, it cannot go down. It can only go up. So let me make something, some simple mathematical exercise. I construct an age index in which I sum increments over the years, one of this delta for each year. And these increments are all independent, identically distributed random variables with some mean and variance, which is the same. But there is no relation between consecutive or different time periods. I just accumulate this. And I can compute the expectation value then of this age index, which is t times the average of each increment, of course, because they're independent. Same thing for the variance. It's t times this sigma square for each of the variable, because they're independent. The covariance is the same as the variance. These are the same two results, just to show them to you. If I compute the correlation coefficient then between the age index at time t plus delta t and the age index today at time t, I get this dependence on time. So it looks all straightforward, but what does this actually mean? That the correlation coefficient goes to 1, which means perfect prediction, perfect correlation, when the ratio delta t divided by t goes to 0. So when the career age of the guy is much larger than the number of years in the future in which you're trying to make the prediction. So for all guys, somehow you guess it right. Although there is no real correlation in this case, right? I'm not talking about papers, I'm not talking about the fact that if I publish a big paper, then I may be more likely to publish another one 2 years from now. This is just mathematics, not just features of this measure, constructed like this. The opposite case instead, when you take, for instance, younger guys or a longer time into the future, when you try to make the prediction, of course, this thing goes down. But if you fix the number of years in the future, so your time horizon, when you want to make the prediction, you see that the farther you go, the better your prediction is going to be. So the older you are, the more accurate you are. Although here, they're not really correlation. This is correlations between numbers. It's the same reasons why you can always try to find, you can always find a correlation between the stock market index or any market, even weeks after today, but you'll never be able to predict the increment. It's the reason why we still have crisis today. The income, the variation, especially the sharp drops of like 2008, and so on. So this is pure mathematics. So then the question comes naturally. So does then the predictability, alleged predictability of the H index represent just a spurious result? So does it, is it mostly this simple numerical autocorrelation? Another way to see that is really to use the real data. And this is what we did. We created 2 null models. We took the real, career data that we had. And for instance, one thing that we did is computing the distribution of the increments of the H index across all these people after 1 year. So physicists, biologists, mathematicians. Of course, you don't have big increments in a single year for the H index. You know how difficult it is also to change it by 1 unit or 2 units. So of course, most of them are pretty low. In some cases, it doesn't change at all. 1 is kind of more likely option. And you construct an H index up to some given time t by taking these increments from this distribution at random. Okay? So basically, you destroy the real correlation, because it's not the same guy anymore. You're taking this delta H at random. But this is the real delta H. So the final result, so the final distribution will be identical for my null model and for the real carriers. And then, of course, what happens is that if you take 2 trajectories, these are 2 representative trajectories of the real thing, where, of course, there is some variability. You see this guy is not doing as well as the other one, who gets up to 80. Whereas, of course, if you randomize, then, since you're picking these increments at random, you're expecting after a while that all these things will compensate and getting pretty much the same thing, which is the reason why these 2 trajectories are very close to each other. These are the mathematical trajectories that I made without real correlation. If you do that, of course, this actually is the first model. The other model, instead, we just took the papers at a given career age, say t. Suppose that after t years from my first paper, I published 3 papers. I will still publish 3 papers, and everybody else will keep the same productivity, only just assigning papers at random, just reshuffling them. So again, it's another way to destroy the correlation by trying to keep as much as possible the original publication history and the citation dynamics of the paper. So if you do that, and you try to check the validity of a simple linear model in which you say that the future H index is simply correlated linearly, these are all linear models we're talking about now, with the current H index, you see that for the two null models, you actually do even better than the Acuna model on the real data. So what is that? So I just created artificial carriers from the same numbers. And still I'm getting something. The number that I'm getting makes me think that this is a great predictor. But you're not predicting anything because you know that there is no correlation. You just took it out. OK, so this is one of the take-home messages. So then what's the future then if cumulative measures are exposed to this risk? So like the stock market index of any country, or in this case, the H index. So let's see what happens if you take a differential measure, so a non-cumulative measure. For instance, the variation of the H index. OK? So if I take the very same mathematical model I used before, in which you have these deltas, which are all independent and identically distributed, this is the expectation value of the increment in this case. This is the variance. The covariance is, of course, 0, because they don't covariate. So by definition, they are independent, so obviously. Which also means that there are no spurious correlations. So this could be a good measure to predict. I mean, if you find predictability here, it may not be a mathematical artifact. So let's see if it's possible to do it. So I use the very same model with the same 5 variables here. Again, this H index, square root of number of citations, papers, sorry. Well, in this case, well, I mean, I consider this one as a variable too. Of course, there is no real value. This is the intercept, but it's 5 parameters. This is, again, the number of distinct journals where you publish your papers, and this is the number of high-impact journals, where, I mean, or papers published in high-impact journals. If you do that, you see the results here. For all data sets we have, these are the prominent physicists. These are the assistant professors in physics, again, so younger guys, prominent biologists, prominent mathematicians, biologists, graphene researchers. On the top, you really see how the R-square coefficient changes with the horizon, so with the time in the future in which you're trying to make your prediction. On the bottom, you see the relative weight, so the relative importance of the standard coefficients of all these variables. So is it more important to know the H index today, or the number of publications, or the number of papers in high-impact journals? As you see, these things varies with the field. And it changes even in time, which means that as of today, you're not able to say if it's more important for the predictability of this number, which could be good because it's not a cumulative number, knowing how many papers the guy has published in high-impact journals rather than the H index, rather than the number of citations, rather than other things. So because this thing can change. So it's which are the focus variables? So I would like to leave you also with this question. And you also see, of course, the predictability somehow is kind of worse. You see there is more fluctuations for younger guys, like these guys here, than for the other data sets in which you put together people of different ages, so the average age is higher than in this one. OK, the last thing I wanted to show you is an exercise that we did, which is another tricky thing about this H index. If you think about it, my H index depends, of course, on the papers that I published so far and the papers I publish in the future. But of course, it's also, I mean, it strongly depends on what you did also before, right? So predictability also means also what really happens in the future, not just to what you published before, but also what you might be publishing afterwards. Because in fact, a tenure committee would be interested mostly in that. They want you to make your biggest contribution in their university. They don't want that your older discoveries are more established in the future. Of course, it helps, but it's not the main goal. I mean, you would like to hire the guy with the highest potential. One way to see that is to see really, to isolate time, divide it into different windows, and we chose 3 different windows. The first 5 years after the first paper, then from the 6th to the 10th year, and then from the 11th to the 15th, and just check, compute these indicators only within that window, without checking what happened before, so the papers before that window, or the citations after that window. So we can create some sort of self-consistent system. So these are the 3 windows. These are the variables that we consider. So for each of these 3 windows we computed, and for each of our scientists, we divided them in groups. I'm going to show you the results for mathematicians, but the results are all qualitatively the same. The total number of papers published in that time window only, the square root of the number of citations to those papers in that same time window, so you don't consider also future citations to that. Really try to disentangle these 3 horizons. And the H index, computed only endogenously, as if the guy's career started at the beginning of the window and ends at the end of the window. Okay, and only that, and only the citations coming from that. If you correlate each of these 3 variables from the early phase to the mid phase, so early to mid, and from the mid to late, you see that correlation is still, in some cases, even acceptable, that there is a trend to have better results, of course, if you are more advanced in your career, which is not surprising because you already know a number of perturbations have been canceled, so to speak. I mean, it's kind of easier, right? On the other hand, who cares, to know what a 50-year-old guy is going to do? The guy's going to die in that university. So, I mean, it's more interesting to do the job for guys who are 30, who still don't know where to go and what to do. So these are for mathematicians. And that's actually my outlook now. So the distribution of the number of citations seems to be field dependent, but it's not the moment you divide the number of citations by the average number of citations or the average performance of papers published in the same year in the same discipline. And then for the predictability of H-index, there are a number of biases. First of all, the H-index is a cumulative measure, so you can get a great result. Don't be too excited because it's just numerical artifacts in most cases. There is a good component coming from that. Predictability depends on career age. It's easier if the guy is old, but maybe it's just a case where it's not so interesting then, right? You want to know what happens to a 30-year-old guy because I'm thinking of giving him a tenure-track position. And non-cumulative measures look better because at least they don't seem to suffer from the same bias, this numerical bias of being non-stationary measures. However, we show that linear models like the ones that were used by Acuna that we try somehow to replicate in our exercise are not really so successful. So maybe there is something that somehow to work on. So the focus, of course, must be on young scholars. These are the 3 papers somehow exposing the things that I told you. This is the Universality paper, 2008. It's kind of old by now. It is very well cited in objective units. And these are the 2 things related to predictability. This appeared on Physics Today a couple of months ago. This is still under review. And Alex is one of the authors of this paper. Like these other guys, have been involved in all these investigations. And with that, I thank you. I can take your questions. Thanks.
Set up the technology. We take 1 or 2 questions if you're kind.
Brian?
Quick question. Can you solve a lot of these problems just by first differencing the time series?
First differencing?
Yeah, first differencing the time series.
What do you mean exactly by this? Sorry, it's not really within my expertise.
You've got your time series, and you're worried about autocorrelation. So you take the change from one period to the next, one period to the next, and you correlate the change against the change. That's called first differencing.
Yeah, okay, I see.
So does that solve the problems you're talking about?
Yeah, we can try to see about this. But I don't think that it will change anything because you already shown the most unfavorable case when you have these increments being totally uncorrelated. So you can place them in any order. And still you get a value very close to 1. So if you get it in this case, it means you can never be sure whether this correlation is coming from that or from the other things, really a priori. So whatever we're really trying to do, because really this is the most unfavorable case that you can have.
I would actually look at the first differencing.
Yeah, okay, so this is a good suggestion. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. But that's why I wanted to give these extreme things. Because, I also, for instance, personally, I'm not an expert in regression models. But, you can be fooled by these things. So let's not be fooled, right? Especially if you use these numbers to say I hired John instead of Mark, right? So let's be careful about this.
Well, still hope there's unpredictability for young scholars.
Yes, of course. Well, I kind of show that. It's still hope.
Oh, it's not. Any other questions?
Laszlo?
So somebody pointed out to me yesterday that there's a paper, and I checked it out, indeed saying that they call the age bubble, that people who write papers about age index, that becomes their most cited paper.
Of the guy.
I wonder, yes,
of the guy.
So I wonder if you see that.
No, I mean, you should know that I have these reviews on clustering, which is almost 2,000 citations. I don't think anything can beat that. I mean, not in Centometrics. Yeah, right. Yes. Yes.
So actually, my name is Mark.
I know. I know, we met a few years ago.
And my name's Brian. I got an issue with the 50 versus the 30-year-old. I think the 50 is the new 30 or something.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I'm much closer to you than the 30s. So, Mark, what?
So my question is can this get a little bit better? So it's a question that's a little self-serving here from what Michael showed a little bit earlier. But could it get better if we looked at relative contributions on things? So you mentioned a tenure committee, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been on some of these guys. You don't really look at every paper the same way. Right?
Yeah.
Should we think of ways to measure that?
Yes.
I know it's field dependent.
Yes.
From biology, you can sort of see it from
Yeah.
the first alternatives.
Yes.
But you can't see that very well in other fields.
Yeah.
Are there ways that we could do a better job?
This is a very good question. I mean, I mentioned before that the Acuna model is the end of a process in which they stopped. I mean, they created this huge data set, which is great. I would like to have that data set because at least they're sure that all the guys are different. And there are more than 3,000. They consider 18 variables. So I showed you 5 of these variables. Some of the other variables are number of years as a graduate student, number of years as a postdoc, average age index of your supervisor, how many times you were first author of a paper, how many times you were last author of a paper. So, and apparently, even if you put all these things together, you don't get a much better correlation function, I mean, R squared than the ones that they show, which is the reason why they went to this maximal economic somehow system, which is also better, you know, you can predict things. Yes, I'm sorry.